I'm
Take
sorry.
three, I'll get it this time.
Okay.
All right, so I'm Craig Erickson. I'm the director of the Cincinnati Fragile X Research and Treatment Center, and I was asked by the National Fragile X Foundation to talk through a number of different questions about cannabidiol or CBD that families impacted by Fragile X have. And recently, we've just seen the proliferation of cannabidiol all over the place. It's become increasingly unregulated in the United States, meaning that it's widely available at various stores. There are some state-by-state differences in regulations. For example, in Ohio, where I am, just in recent months, the government decided to essentially remove all regulation of cannabidiol itself. In 2018, the United States, the federal government, Congress passed, and it was signed by the president, the Farm Bill of 2018, that essentially removed cannabis not containing THC, so cannabis products that are THC free, from regulation that applies to THC or more classic marijuana products. And what this means is the cannabis plant itself, when in nature, has THC in it, which is sort of the psychoactive or the reason people smoke marijuana or pot historically for an effect, and it also has cannabidiol in it. But individuals can have bred cannabis plants and cannabis as a product to be THC free, or essentially have no detectable THC. And these products in the future are not going to be regulated by the federal government and the Drug Enforcement Agency the way that THC containing products are regulated. Now, what's happened is it takes a long time for sort of enforcement and regulation to catch up with law. And so the same way that the current Zynerba study in Fragile X syndrome, which is a cannabidiol study, is enforced and regulated by the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, like it was a study of full-on marijuana with THC, even though it's not, that level of regulation is going away slowly in America as enforcement catches up with law. And that's the reason why we see cannabidiol everywhere, because non-THC containing cannabis products are not going to be regulated like they have THC in them long term. So with that, cannabidiol is everywhere. And we need to understand, what is the difference between CBD and THC? So they both in nature occur in the cannabis plant, but cannabis plants can be altered over time to not contain THC, or THC can be removed. Cannabidiol can be made synthetically, so it doesn't come from a plant. And so they share that they originally came from the same kind of plant, but they're really mechanistically and otherwise completely different. So THC has a psychotropic, a get high effect. THC can, increase appetite. And cannabidiol is a separate chemical. So they're just located in the same plant originally. But the cannabidiol, or the CBD, for example, that's being studied in the Zynerba clinical trial in Fragile X, is synthetically made. So it's not a cannabidiol even from an original cannabis or an old style marijuana plant. So they get confused because they have the same origin originally in a common plant, but they're really completely different. So pure cannabidiol doesn't have THC in it, and pure THC doesn't have cannabidiol in it. Now, the somewhat confusing part, if you're not already confused, because these topics are tough to talk through, that there is some CBD that has THC in it and some without. So in states where regular marijuana or THC is legalized, for example, in Colorado or California, among others, you could very easily find a product that has cannabidiol and THC in it and readily purchase that. In states where THC is essentially still illegal, or maybe remanded to only medical use. If you got over-the-counter CBD, it really should not have THC in it. Now, the problem that we run into is that these are essentially supplement products. So if you buy CBD, it's a supplement. So as a supplement, it's just not regulated to normal FDA drug standards. So there can be trace impurities. There can be very small amounts of THC in a CBD product. In fact, we've had a couple of families giving their child what they thought was just CBD that, if you read the label, maybe had very small amounts of THC in it, and their child tested positive for THC. So I always counsel families that there's not a guarantee that over-the-counter CBD is completely THC-free. Now, with that said, I've never heard of a case in my experience of people taking CBD oils or gummies that was, not supposed to have THC in it, that their child, quote, got high or had abnormal reactions. So I don't think there's a clinical THC risk of a THC-like abnormal response, but there could be trace amounts of THC in with CBD. So we were also asked, is CBD legal in every state? I think that's ever changing. It's like every week that's different. There were some questions about disqualification from local, state, federal monies or services. So the only thing I can say for insight on this is we have had, again, these rare cases of, for example, children in the custody of a state that were taking CBD over the counter and had trace THC in it, and they could be taken out of a home. So that was a very rare instance. But I would recommend that if anyone has a specific question in a state, that they consult their developmental disability caseworker or service worker and straight up ask that question. Because as CBD becomes so freely available all over the place, it's hard to fathom that it's going to be a real block on service utilization, especially because that Farm Bill of 2018 is essentially, decriminalizing and deregulating cannabis that doesn't have THC in it. So I think that was a real positive step, but it takes a while for it to be enforced that way, is what we're finding. There's also a question about whether CBD has an effect on the missing Fragile X protein. I don't think anybody's thinking that CBD helps replace the protein or make up specifically for the protein. There's a question about how CBD acts on the body, and frankly, I don't think that's fully understood. I attended a CBD workshop late last year about the psychiatric, mental health, and brain study effects of CBD, and I think the short answer is the exact mechanisms are not well understood. CBD is undergoing extensive study, not only in Fragile X, but it's already FDA approved to treat Lennox-Gastaut epilepsy, which I think is a really needed and wonderful treatment. It's also being studied in anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's being studied in various addiction syndromes and disorders. But the mechanism is poorly understood. But we would not think that the mechanism is directly interacting with the Fragile X protein. So what is cannabidiol theoretically target, and why could it be useful in Fragile X? Well, I think the real thought is that it may have some properties reducing anxiety. And certainly when families come in and their child's taking a CBD product, a lot of what they talk about is targeting anxiety. Does this target potentially irritability or aggression or improve speech? So my thoughts there are, if anxiety is significantly improved, a lot of other things may get better too. I think the problem is we just don't know if the cannabidiol that's available is going to have this effect or not. I've had families taking cannabidiol for years, first starting via the internet when it was still a little sketchy with state enforcement, and maybe it, wasn't, it was letter of the law, non-legal in certain states, and people still tried it. And we've had a lot of families, start with the oils, and generally they were hoping for anxiety change. I would have to say the first reports I heard in clinic from families that were trying were not uniformly positive. Never really heard of any severe side effects or problems or abnormalities, and cannabidiol has a profile of not having a toxic effect on organ systems, so it has a pretty good safety profile, but didn't really hear a lot of positive things. And then more recently, Zynerba Pharmaceuticals has been studying cannabidiol gel at doses of 250 milligrams a day of the gel for individuals that weigh less than 35 kilograms, which is like roughly less than 75 pounds, or 500 milligrams a day for people that weigh over 35 kilograms or over 75 pounds. So I think the first thing to realize there is that's a pretty hefty dose that's under study in a well-designed study in youth with Fragile X. It's a much higher dose than you would typically take over the counter. For example, I looked up some of the CBD gummies, and they're about 25 milligrams a gummy. So for just equivalent dosing, and it's not perfectly equivalent because differences between a gel on your skin and swallowing it, but like oral CBD gummies may have 25 milligrams of CBD, so that would be 20 gummies a day to get that higher over 75-pound person dosing of cannabidiol. And we're certainly not telling people to take that many gummies a day, but I think there's some real potency differences that need to be accounted for and can make it, honestly really tricky to take cannabidiol over the counter. So, I'm not here to endorse cannabidiol use or make any specific recommendations, but there are some real dosing differences there that make it tough to just take, what you can get over the counter. That can be a real challenge. So I was also asked, can CBD interact with other medications? The answer is yes. And I would really recommend that any parent, caregiver, family member of an individual impacted by Fragile X tell their prescriber, their medical doctor, whoever may be writing for medications for them or providing medical care, that their child's taken CBD, because it can impact liver metabolism of a number of different drugs via some liver enzymes. And it can have an impact on some of the other behavioral medicines your child may be taking. It can compete for liver metabolism that can potentially increase levels of other drugs, as it may sort of, use up the system, so to speak, in drug metabolism. So that can be a real issue. There's also some rare reports of other conditions, like people that have bleeding diseases or they coagulate too much and they take a medicine called warfarin or Coumadin, and then they take cannabidiol and it really messes with their warfarin levels. So that probably doesn't apply to a lot of today's audience, but it's a key example of how cannabidiol can really impact dosing and metabolism of other drugs. So that's one of many reasons why I would really share with your provider if you're caring for an individual who's taking cannabidiol. I think it's very important. There's a question about should I use CBD if my child has seizures? So, there's a drug called Epidiolex that's FDA approved. That's cannabidiol for severe seizure disorders. So the first thing I would do is, if your child has seizures, ask their neurologist, their epilepsy doctor, if prescription cannabidiol would be suited for them, because it can be really helpful for some severe seizure disorders and probably not as helpful for others. So I think that's probably the best way to go versus trying to take for seizures cannabidiol essentially over the counter. You can understand people wanting to try it over the counter if their child doesn't have any FDA-approved indication, and then you can't get insurance to pay for it. But if you have seizures, I would really talk to the seizure doctor about that. But I would say there is, some good evidence that cannabidiol can help certain forms of seizure disorder in significant ways, which is really great and important. But what that effect is specifically in people with Fragile X, we don't know. So it's an easy question because neurologists, I think, are getting asked all the time about cannabidiol, and they're well prepared to respond to the seizure question. I was asked about, different dosing for seizures versus the dosing that we're studying in Fragile X with Zynerba and maybe the dosing of over-the-counter. And I'm going to pull up right now the dosing in seizures, and I will answer that question because I do not prescribe Epidiolex. I leave that to seizure or epilepsy doctors who we collaborate with. And I will, give me 1 second, we'll have that. I'll look that one up, and I'll get back to that question here in a second. But there are definitely some dosing differences with seizures and other indications. The next question is just a basic, where do I start with CBD? What do I do first? Do the clinical trial if you can. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's good science. It's enrolling all over the country. It's an important thing, but what if your child's found to not be eligible for the clinical trial, or what if they're out of the age range? I think that's a really good question. So I think the place to start is I'd have a conversation with your child's physician and ask. And I would say that the feedback I get from families is the changes in recent years that are putting cannabidiol in forms like gummies have made it a lot easier to take than the oils. Tolerability has been improved. There's no evidence of organ toxicity. There is this potential to show interaction with other drug metabolism, so that's an important thing to talk about. We don't really know what the dosing should be, but as I said earlier, we're definitely studying, pretty high dosing compared to what it's going to say on the bottle of cannabidiol. But at the same time, we don't really want people going off and taking 10 times what it says on a bottle they get over the counter. So that does become a tricky situation. So in that kind of situation, I tell families, look, I'm not going to tell you that I think cannabidiol is going to hurt your child. If you're following the basic recommendations on a bottle, I've never heard of an incident of a severe adverse reaction. I don't think there's any good evidence it's toxic to your body. At the same time, I don't know if it's going to do anything to help. So we're just really honest about that. Reducing anxiety would be awesome if it happened, but we're just not sure. So as long as people are aware of the risk with drug metabolism, they're aware of the really small risk of impurities because, it's a supplement, it's not perfectly regulated. We don't have a problem with families trying cannabidiol, in particular if they can obtain it fully legally without any associated risks. And I ask families to, hey, if you're going to start this, let's be upfront about it. Tell us what form you're taking. Tell us what the dose is. Bring the bottle in, and we're happy to look at it. And then at least we can partner with families in knowing what they're taking and kind of move forward from there. The other thing I tell families is the same thing we would do in a clinical trial. It's always good to have healthy skepticism because we all want individuals to do better. Your Fragile X doctors want it, families want it, therapists want it. So it's really easy to start anything and then, will things to be better. So you want to just have a healthy skepticism and look at something and say, hey, we're trying this. Maybe we should try it when we're also not changing other medications. Maybe we should try it when there's not a lot of other change in our lives or the life of my child. That's sometimes easier said than done. So try to isolate things, then start something. And then look really closely and think ahead of time. hey, if this new treatment was working, what would we want to see improve? And then ask yourself, is that any different? I think that's a really nice way of starting any new treatment. Maybe make a list of, hey, what manifestations or what results of anxiety as we feel it exists, as we observe it in the family, as we see in our family member impacted by Fragile X. How do we see it? And then is it different? And maybe get input from others around you, other family members, schools, therapists, whatever, and try to get a feel for it. So if you're going to try something, try to do it in a regimented way if you can, because it's very easy. And in my career, the last 15 plus years, we've done this a ton as clinicians. We try something new, we're excited about it, and then we just have rose-colored glasses and we think things are better. So we don't want to be Debbie Downers and negative, but we want to just be very rational and try to think ahead of time. If something was better, how would that be in a quantifiable way? Like, my son or daughter would, be able to follow one-step commands, or they would be able to sit in their desk for more than 2 minutes at a time at school, or they would, reduce their biting of their wrist in certain situations, or they'd be able to tolerate sitting down at dinner at a preferred restaurant. I mean, think about some tangible things and then see if stuff's better. And that sounds simple, but I think that's a targeted way to kind of look at new treatment. And if you're going to try out something like CBD over the counter, I think that approach really makes sense. Another question is, are all brands of CBD basically the same? I said this is a really hard question, and I think in one day there's probably a new CBD manufacturer. I think the key is try to get the purest form you can, read the ingredients, shoot to have no trace THC, I think makes the most sense. But it's kind of the Wild West of CBD, and it's all over the place. And, today we could talk about manufacturer X, and tomorrow we would talk about Y and Z, and it's a challenge. So I think trying to get as pure as you can makes sense. Trying to avoid any trace THC makes sense. And then we get asked a lot about oils and formulations. The feedback, like I think I said earlier, I've gotten from families is, the gummies are a lot easier to take, and that intuitively makes a lot of sense to me. I think the oils and how long you keep it in your mouth and under your tongue, I think all else being equal, the feedback I've heard is that the gummies are an easier way to go. And then really trying to have the most purified form you can find of that, probably makes some sense. We were asked about making your own capsules. I guess CBD capsules. I'm not sure about that. I think if we're trying to take the oil and put it in a capsule form, I think that would add a layer of complexity to it. Hopefully the other formulations, like the edible forms of CBD alone, can kind of get over that hump. A next question is, if I use a gummy, does it make a difference if I, for example, have a 25 milligram gummy at one time or cut it in half and give it every 4 hours? I think the honest answer is people aren't exactly sure. The half-life or the time to half maximum levels in your system is not extremely well established in these formulations. As I said earlier, the gummy dosing is generally pretty low. We've had families give some positive reports of taking gummies twice a day, and that tends to be what it says on the bottle. I don't have any reason to give different advice, but at the same time, we just don't have good data. So again, it's one of those things that I think you're just best served to really, look at things with that healthy skepticism. We still want good to happen. And if you feel like things are very helpful for a few hours and then wear off, maybe you adjust your dosing interval. But you want to do that with some data and some things that you're really tracking to see if they change with your child, to give you justification to to really up the frequency to something like every few hours, because it's hard to take anything every few hours and remember. But again, we don't have great evidence on the spacing of the timing of what's available. Next question: is it okay to order it off the internet? If I can get it on the internet, does it mean it's legal? Is it better to go to a store in my area? So, great question. As best I can tell, quote, purchasing over the internet legally existed before it was legalized in states. So like a year ago, I could have bought a ton of cannabidiol from Amazon and had it delivered to my house. Now, in Ohio last year, that was probably still technically against the law. So I think basically what happened is a lot of times state law may not legally allow for something, but the law is just not being enforced. Because I can guarantee in Ohio last year, I never heard of any enforcement issues with people purchasing cannabidiol on Amazon. So, in that sense, if your state allows you to go down the street and buy it, it's probably not different if you order it on the internet. And now, I read articles that said cannabidiol is going to be hitting major grocery store and places like Target and Walmart distribution potentially. And so we're just going to see it everywhere. So, once it's everywhere, it's kind of like the cat's out of the bag as far as regulating it. We even see a lot of video stores in Ohio that are taking up cannabidiol, which I guess makes sense because I don't think many people rent videos anymore. So it makes sense as a side business there. Are there any bad things that can happen to my body from using CBD? Can you overdose on it? I don't think overdose is very well established. I think toxicity studies show that there's not a lot of organ toxicity risks, like it isn't going to hurt your kidneys or your liver or your thyroid. There's not a lot of evidence that it causes weight gain. There's not evidence that it causes addiction or you get dependent on cannabidiol specifically. Any medication, whether it's a supplement or whatever, you can be allergic to it. Pretty much anything that's maybe having a good effect on your brain can probably cause negative behavioral changes. We haven't heard a lot about that, but I would always recommend people monitor for it. Pretty much any medicine or supplement can cause things like headaches, upset stomach, those kind of things. But, overall, cannabidiol is really well tolerated. And so I think tolerability has not been a big issue. I don't think we've had a family come in yet that have, stopped it because of some weird tolerability issue. Now, I've always wondered, is that because the dosing's so low of what you can purchase? Maybe, I don't know that, but that sort of is what it is there. Where can I find more information about it? So there are some good sources. I think there have been some nice scientific review articles written on cannabidiol that are freely available through the National Institutes of Health has an online search directory, and I'll work with the foundation to get some links to some good scientific reviews out that talk about cannabidiol and a lot of different disorders, and they highlight a lot of the uncertainty I was talking about. I was looking at those articles over the weekend. So I think I'd like to provide some resources to families on cannabidiol in general that's available, and there are some good papers out there. So I think we'll try to do that. Are there some websites better than others? I mean, look, anybody that's selling cannabidiol wants you to buy their cannabidiol. So I think going to sort of third-party sources like some of these scientific reviews and articles can be helpful to get more information. Is it okay to use what you read on Facebook about what other parents are doing? That's a really tough question, what I would say is I think sharing experiences can be very helpful. I think when you start a new treatment, whether it's cannabidiol or anything, whether it's a prescription drug, whatever it may be, whether your child's in a study or not in a study, you just want to really think about what do you think you would like to see improve, what can improve their quality of life, How are you going to quantify it? Who do you want information from? Do you want it from school? Do you want it from a different family member? Do you want it from, some relative you see every couple of weeks? Because maybe more change will happen and they'll notice it because it's not incremental. Whatever it may be, just have a real method to the approach of wondering if things are better. Because if things aren't better, there's no reason to continue these treatments necessarily long term. Which brings up a great question. How many weeks should we try something before giving up on it? I would say a month or two is probably good enough to want to see an effect with cannabidiol. I guess I kind of dodged the Facebook question. Those are hard questions, but I think I would certainly think that information on social media could help with tolerability. How did your child take something? Did it taste awful? Those kind of things could be helpful. Have there been trials on CBD in people with or without disabilities? There's a ton of these trials going on. There's a lot of trials in mental health and anxiety disorders and addiction disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder and other conditions. There's, of course, the Fragile X Zynerba project ongoing that I'd encourage people to consider if they're interested in cannabidiol and they have a child in the youth age range. And where do you find out more about cannabidiol trials? So this is what I would do. You go to clinicaltrials.gov. That's clinicaltrials, one word, .gov. And then you just type in cannabidiol in the first box, and you'll get a ton of trials and information. And if you put in cannabidiol, and then in the next section, the next block, you put in Fragile X, you'll get some really good, unbiased, federally, approved language about the Zynerba trials, including that dosing stuff I talked about before. So that's all freely available information I recommend people take a look at. Are there other herbal supplements for anxiety? There's certainly, if you look it up on the internet, you'll hear a lot of them. I don't have a lot of faith in them. I think there's some other risks of drug-drug interactions for herbal supplements for anxiety. I think you don't really know what you're taking is a challenge. There's nothing I would really specifically mention where I think there's some solid scientific data behind it. So, I think cannabidiol, while there's a ton more unknown than known, at least I think we have a place to start for people interested in giving it a try. And, I would kind of tie it up here and say, my going through this discussion with the being asked to do it by the National Fragile X Foundation, that we're not endorsing the use of CBD supplements or clinical trial participation or anything for individuals living with Fragile X. So I really would want everyone to discuss their proposed use of cannabidiol with their personal physician that's working with their child or their loved one impacted by Fragile X, because I think it's an important decision. We certainly have a lot of families in our Fragile X program that have trialed cannabidiol. We're enrolling people in the cannabidiol trial now. So it's certainly an issue we can't ignore, but we also just don't have a ton of data to make a lot of specific recommendations. And I'm not one to be evasive with questions, but in a lot of these areas, there's not a lot of evidence. And I'll be sure that we get a link to some nice review papers and some more objective review of cannabidiol and medicine that can give families some information. So I've appreciated our time here, and I hope that this has been helpful.
Thank you, Craig. That was perfect. It was great. I thought your